Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled BP Energy Outlook, the Forces Shaping the Global Energy Transition. We're grateful to our presenter, William Zimmern, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find on our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot attend today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please use Zoom's Q&A option at the bottom of your window to type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. William Zimmern, Head of Energy Transition and Systems Analysis at BP. William, over to you.
Great, thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining. It's a great pleasure to be here, and many thanks for the IAEE for the invitation to speak today. So let me just put my slides up on screen. Hopefully you can all see that. So firstly, who am I? So I work at BP, and I've been at BP for the last 5 years. And I've been asked today to speak about BP's energy outlook, which for those of you who aren't aware is sort of BP's view of long-term global energy markets. That expression is doing a lot of work long-term in the sense that this product, we don't look at short-term fluctuations. So it's looking at the long-term structural trends. Now, we've been publishing the Energy Outlook for the last 10 years. So this is its 10th edition, and I've been managing it for the last 5 years. And over that time period, you know, a lot has changed. Obviously, the numbers have changed, the themes have changed. We've changed how we do the modeling and how we do our analysis. But one thing that has remained steady throughout that time is what it is and what it isn't and what it's used for. So primarily, the Energy Outlook is a tool for us at BP to think about the global energy context and develop our strategy and our business plans within that context. So it's primarily a business tool, but it isn't a forecasting tool. I think probably everyone on this call will be aware that forecasting energy markets is impossible. You can't do it with any accuracy. So what we have always done is we've taken the view that we're never going to know the future, but we want to understand the range of uncertainties of future scenarios. So the outlook is primarily sort of looking at a range of scenarios, tweaking different assumptions to understand how those scenarios might change when we change different assumptions, and that gives us an understanding of the uncertainties. So everything I'm about to say should be viewed within that context, that we're not saying that this is a forecast of the future. We're saying that these are scenarios that when we make certain assumptions, these are the outcomes. So I start with that, and I think the one thing I can guarantee you is everything I'm about to tell you won't happen. There'll be sort of, you know, things that we can't possibly imagine in terms of future expectations, and we can't possibly track that. So before I start, just a bit of housekeeping. I often get asked, you know, why do we publish this? You know, this is an important strategic document. Why would BP want to publish this and let everyone see it? There's a couple of reasons. I think probably the most important reason is to explain to our stakeholders, you know, how we view the future or how we view potential futures. So that's an important one. For me, one of the key reasons is to receive feedback from people like you. There's a discipline of publication, but it's also to try and understand sort of what we're saying. Is it right? Is it wrong? Are the themes we're looking at correct? Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? And so I think for me, the most important part of these types of presentations are the Q&A at the end. So can I ask you sort of as we go along, please do ask questions and we'll try and get to it. Actually, I think it's often the best part of these presentations. When you are asking a question, if you can, don't feel obliged, but if you can say where in the world you are asking from, because I think that context is really important for me in terms of trying to answer it appropriately. And if you are working for an organization, if you can say what organization you're from, again, don't feel you have to, but again, it can be useful context to try and answer the question more specifically. That's my introduction. So let me get on to the outlook itself. Okay, I'm trying to. Oh, there we go. Sorry. So so most of the analysis. So we published this outlook in August last year. So we were in the midst of the pandemic. We passed the bottom, but uncertainty was still enormous. As I think you'd all agree, there's still a huge uncertainty in terms of the shape of the recovery. But this was published in August, and in our most recent outlook, we focused on three main scenarios. The first scenario we called rapid, which is this orange line here. And in this scenario, we assumed a range of policy measures, including a very significant increase in carbon prices to about $250 a ton in most in 2050 in most developed economies, and slightly less in most emerging economies. So along with carbon prices, we also assumed significant regulations in the transport and all other sectors. And the outcome of that scenario is that carbon emissions from energy use fell by about 70% by 2050. So you can see in that orange line there. We also looked at a net zero scenario where, alongside similar policies to rapid, we also assumed a faster shift in behavioural change and societal preferences. And the impact of the combination of the government policies and the change in society and their preferences reduced carbon emissions by 2050 by around 95%. So almost complete decarbonisation. And that scenario we called net zero. And then finally, we had a scenario called business as usual, which you can see in green here, which sees emissions increase over the next 10 years or so before flattening out and finally ending about 10% below current CO2 emissions in 2050. And when I say current here, I mean 2019. So this is pre-pandemic emissions. So there are the three broad scenarios that we looked at in the most recent outlook that we published last year. How do they compare to external scenarios? Well, here you can see two coloured swathes. Sort of the pinky swathe, which is called pinky swathe here, represents the range of scenarios from the IPCC 2019 report. This is the range of scenarios that purport to be well below 2 degrees scenarios. And then the blue swathe here is those scenarios that are 1.5 degree scenarios. And I think you can see quite clearly that our rapid scenario is broadly in line with the median IPCC well below 2 degree scenarios. And our net zero scenario is broadly in line with the 1.5 degrees. It sort of overshoots slightly at the start and then undershoots at the end. But when you look at cumulative emissions, it is similar to the median IPCC scenarios. So I think in your head, sort of when I talk about these scenarios as we go through, you can think of rapid as well below 2 degrees and net zero as 1.5 degrees. So what do I want to cover today? So I thought I'd cover 4 key questions, and then they'll hopefully in the Q&A, we'll have more questions that come up, and I've got a range of slides which I can jump to if the questions are relevant. So the first thing is, what do we know about the energy transition? I've explained that we can't see the future, but there may be some things that we can say with more confidence than other things. The second question is the outlook for oil demand. I know this is often comes up, so I thought it's useful to cover that. The third one is the role of natural gas and what role that plays in the transition. And the final one is how do we see hydrogen, and what role might hydrogen play in a decarbonising world? So they're the questions that I thought I'd tackle in the first part of the presentation. But as I said again, if you have other questions, very happy to take them at the end. So firstly, what do we know? Now, I think one way, when I go out and speak to our businesses and I say, you know, we have no idea what's going to happen next year, let alone in 30 years' time, that's not particularly helpful for them. We have to develop strategy. We have to make decisions. So you just can't say we don't know. But one way to think about the future is to look at trends that are sort of common across all three of the scenarios. So what are the common trends across three scenarios that we can say with some confidence, whether we're in a rapid world, a business as usual world, or a net zero world, that actually you know, we can say some confidence that that might happen. And now I showed you those emissions, and those emissions, they span quite a broad range of outcomes. And so if you've got an outcome that is consistent in all three scenarios, we could have more confidence that this is something that might happen in the future. So what I'd like to pick out three factors that we think are consistent across the three scenarios. The first is the role of fossil fuels, which you can see on the left here. In all three scenarios, fossil fuels, which we define as coal, oil, and natural gas, decline from about 85% of primary energy today to between 65% and 20% by 2050. So we see a steady decline in fossil fuels in all scenarios. Now, this is a common feature, I think, across many scenarios, but it's actually, it shouldn't be taken for granted. This is something that is completely unprecedented. We haven't seen well, not completely unprecedented, but it is unprecedented. We haven't seen an absolute decline in any single traded fossil fuel in our developed history, in modern history. Whereas we are seeing a decline of that across all three scenarios that we have looked at. So this is something that isn't that shouldn't be taken for granted and is a significant change from the past. The second common feature that we see across a range of scenarios is the growth in renewables. And we define renewables as wind, solar, geothermal, and bioenergy. So we exclude hydroelectric power, which is a more mature renewable energy. And so I'm not talking about that here. So today, renewables make up just over 5% of primary energy. We think in the three scenarios, the percentage of primary energy will increase from about 20% in business as usual to just below 60% in net zero. But in all three scenarios, we see a very sharp increase in renewables. And again, this is unprecedented. We have never seen in certainly modern history a single fuel penetrating the energy mix as fast as we expect renewables to penetrate the energy mix over the next 30 years. And that includes BAU. It is a very, very significant increase, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And then the third feature that we see that is common across all the scenarios is the increase in electrification. The world is continuing to electrify, and we think this will increase from about 25% today of final consumption to between 35 and over 50% in 2050. So ongoing electrification. So these are themes that are key to our strategy, our new strategy, and they're things that are common across the range of scenarios that we've looked at. So we think we can have some confidence in. So another way to look at the future is to think, actually, instead of looking at a range of scenarios, just look at one scenario, but just but in some more detail. So this chart here shows the rapid transition scenario, so consistent with the world below 2 degrees. But instead of starting in 1965, it goes all the way back to 1900. So it's a very, very long-term, sort of a long-term data set, which we've put together. There's a few features about this chart that I think it's worth pulling out. I think the first one is that sort of when in modern history, there has tended to be a single dominant fuel source. So you can see that in this grey line here, coal was a dominant source for the first half of the 20th century. We saw a steady increase in oil, but then in about the 1960s, we see oil started to maintain its dominance, and has been the biggest fuel for the past 40, 50 years. So there's been a single fuel that has dominated the energy mix in our modern history. In the future, that is not true. As you can see here, over the next 20 years or so, there isn't a single fuel that is dominant. You can see that oil, coal, natural gas, other non-fossil fuels and renewables all play a significant part, particularly over the next 20 years. After about 2035, you can see that renewables start to become the dominant fuel source. But in this transition period, the period we're entering, we're looking at a very different world where all fuels play a very significant part in terms of providing energy to the global energy system. Now, this has quite significant strategic implications for companies like BP, and all producers and consumers of energy. I think the first point is that the fact that there's an increasing the variety of fuels mean that there's increasing competition between different energy sources. I think in sort of historically there hasn't been significant customer choice. If you wanted to fill your car up with power, you essentially had oil and that was it. Nowadays, there is fuels compete across almost every end-use sector. I mean, and I think there's, passenger car transport is a great example where in the past you could use oil. Now you can use oil, you can use electricity. There's in some regions you can use natural gas. In the future, there could be an option for hydrogen. So suddenly, in the past, when one fuel has been dominant, there's now a variety and there's now a choice. So that's one very important sort of strategic implication of a chart like this. The second point is that you've suddenly got a range of fuels that customers need, and that increases the need for integration. I think in the past, companies could focus on providing, say, just natural gas or just coal, whereas in the future, customers are going to need a range of different fuels for different uses. And so there is a need for companies like BP to continue to think about integration, how they integrate and provide solutions to their customers. The third point is on the supply side, which is that fossil fuels, so in the world of declining fossil fuel demand, the owners of fossil fuels are increasingly competing for investments. It is not obvious that in fact, it's less than obvious. We do not expect all the fossil fuels that are currently in the ground to be extracted and combusted, because if we do, the world would blow its carbon budget many times over. So there is a competition for investment dollars between resource holders. So that is an implication of the rapid transition and what that means. I think the final point, which is important, which is when you put all of these together, it's clear that the rents are shifting from producers to consumers. The rents are shifting from upstream to downstream and ultimately to customers. And so it's sort of analysis like this which has informed our new strategy, which is more customer focused, and it's essentially looking at this part of over the next 20 years and seeing this competition between different fuel types. Okay, so that's some comments on what we do know. I thought I'd spend some time now looking at the outlook for oil demand. So this chart here shows oil demand in our three scenarios. First thing to look at is that, or to say, is that oil demand declines in all three scenarios. Obviously, the decline is more pronounced in rapid and net zero. So in rapid, we see oil demand decline about 50%, and in net zero, about 75%. They're quite significant declines in oil demand. In business as usual, oil is more resilient, and we expect it to increase marginally for the next 10 years or so before plateauing and slowly declining so that it is slightly below, or I think it's 10% below the 2019 levels by 2050. So we do see a decline in oil demand, even in BAU, albeit much more slowly. So what is driving that profile, or what is driving the profile of oil demand? Essentially, transport is the biggest driver of this. This chart here shows the change in oil demand between 2018 and 2050 by different sectors. The light blue sector shows the passenger cars, and the dark blue sector shows sort of other roads. So this would be medium and long haul trucking. And you can see combined, the two road sectors make up the majority of that fall in oil demand. So about 30 million barrels a day in rapid and about 35 million barrels a day in net zero. So it's really being driven by this road sector and transport demand in general. And why is that? Well, essentially, it's driven by two key factors. So this chart here shows the factors impacting, this is now passenger cars, liquids demand, or passenger car oil demand. So liquids and oil are broadly similar. So over the next 30 years, we expect the demand for transport to increase very significantly. So as you can see, these blue bars here, they show what the increase would have been. So increase in vehicle kilometers over the next, between today and 2050. It is a very significant increase. And the reason for it is this is the period when the developing world starts to be able to afford to buy and to use passenger transport. So it's between about $10,000 and $20,000 when passenger transports and passenger cars becomes affordable. This is where China is at the moment. We expect India and other parts of Asia to enter that bracket of income over the coming 30 years, and towards the back end of the outlook also we expect Africa to join them as well. So that increases the demand for transport, increases the demand for vehicle kilometers, and all things equal, it would have increased the demand for oil. But there are two countervailing forces. The first one is electrification, so the transports. So in the past, it would have been all of these vehicles would have been powered by gasoline or diesel. That is not the case in the scenarios that we see in the future. And in fact, even in business as usual, we expect 25% of passenger kilometers to be electrified. So electrification does play a part, but an even more important part is fuel efficiency, especially as an average over the period. And this also gets, this quite often gets overlooked. The fleet now is less than 5% of the passenger car fleet is electric at the moment. And actually, it's the drive in it's improvements in efficiency which reduce liquids demand far more than the electrification of the fleet in the period 2018 to 2050. Beyond 2050, electrification becomes more important, but in terms of cumulative oil demand and cumulative emissions, efficiency plays as important, a more important role than electrification. And then I covered that. So that's looking at what we know about oil demand, and happy to take questions on that at the end. Next, I'd like to touch on what role natural gas can play in the energy transition. So this chart here, again, similar to the oil demand chart, shows our views on natural gas consumption in the three scenarios. I think when you step back, there's a few things to take away. I think the first thing that I take away from this chart is that natural gas is more resilient than oil across the scenarios. In rapid, oil declined from around today, whereas here you can see in rapid, natural gas continues to increase for the next 15 to 20 years before starting to decline and end at about the same volume of demand in 2050 as we see today. Maybe it's slightly lower actually. We see ongoing growth in business as usual, and even in net zero we see some increase in natural gas, or you could see it a plateauing before a decline towards the end of the outlook. So across the scenarios, natural gas is more resilient than oil. And then obviously the question is, why is this? Why is natural gas more resilient? I see that there are two reasons. The first reason is that natural gas supports the shift away from coal. The coal is still the dominant energy source in many developing countries. And in order to take away or to decarbonize that coal fleet in these fast-growing developing economies, which not only need to decarbonize the coal fleet, but also need to expand energy consumption as people enter that phase, that period of high energy consumption growth, you actually need natural gas to complement the growth in renewables that I talked earlier. So it plays a particular important role in the emerging markets to decarbonize coal and take coal out of the mix. And the second point is that natural gas combined with CCUS can provide a source of near zero carbon energy. And that's actually what these two charts here show. So I'll just spend a bit of time explaining exactly what they do show. So the first chart on the left here shows the share of natural gas that is consumed in 2050 with and without CCUS. So CCUS is carbon capture and storage. So this is where you capture the emissions at the point of combustion, and then you put the CO2, you store it underground, or CCUS is you can use it to make products or for other purposes. So this chart shows our views of natural gas, and you can see that in the rapid scenario, actually almost 40% of natural gas in 2050 has CCS attached to it, and in net zero it's nearly 3/4. So there's a very significant share of gas consumption. And the feature of CCUS is that it means that natural gas can be consumed and used in a net zero world well beyond 2050. So it can be an important part of the long-term energy transition. So that's one reason why natural gas is more resilient than oil. And here is another take on this, is looking at natural gas with CCUS as a share of primary energy. And you can see that it's between 8 and almost 10% of natural gas with CCUS as a share of primary energy. Now, there are two uses for it. One is where natural gas is consumed in the power and industrial sector, and the emissions are captured. And the other use, which proves its resilience, particularly in net zero, is to create blue hydrogen. So this is where you use natural gas and SMR processes to create hydrogen, and then capture the CO2 at the point where the hydrogen is created. And it's quite an efficient way to capture the CO2 at that point. And so you can see, it's particularly in the net zero scenario, blue hydrogen is driving quite a lot of that gas demand, and providing quite a lot of final primary energy, primary energy. So that is why we see natural gas as being more resilient than oil, even in accelerated transition scenarios. So the final question, or the final point I'd like to tackle, is looking at hydrogen. Hydrogen, over the past couple of years, has received a lot of attention recently. We keep on seeing, it seems every other week there's a new hydrogen strategy, or a country will release a new hydrogen roadmap. Actually, this is because there's a common consensus and understanding in that to decarbonize fully, to reach net zero, for the world to reach net zero, electrification and gas with CCUS is not enough. There needs to be another fuel that can be combusted, that that can be combusted, that at the point of combustion doesn't release CO2. And that's the difference between hydrogen and natural gas. They share a lot of common traits in that they can be burned at very high temperatures, that they can be stored relatively cheaply. But the difference between hydrogen and natural gas is that when hydrogen is combusted, there is no CO2 released. And so it's a much cleaner fuel at the point of combustion. So the world, I think, has come to realize that hydrogen is required to decarbonize. And so we see this chart here shows our views of hydrogen use in the different sectors and why it's used. So before I start, I should say this is hydrogen used for energy combustion. So this doesn't include the 65 million tons or so of hydrogen that is currently used as a feedstock for ammonia and to create fertilizer. So that's not included here. This is hydrogen use as a carrier of energy or as an energy vector. And as you can see in both scenarios, we expect hydrogen to be a significant amount of hydrogen. It's about 10% of final energy in rapid and nearly double that in net zero. You can also see that it really accelerates towards the back end of the outlook. So between 2035 and 2050, you can see hydrogen consumption really accelerates because it takes time to build out this infrastructure. It takes time to build out the facilities, the electrolyzers, the blue hydrogen facilities, the transportation, the pipelines on the supply side, and it takes time to build out the use on the demand side. But in rapid, we see that the demand is for two specific reasons. One is in industry, where you need sort of particular high temperature heat combustion. So the iron and steel sector would be a good example. There's a number of chemical processes where you need high heat. So hydrogen is perfect to be used within the industrial sector there. We also see hydrogen demand in the transport sector. And this is mainly for long distance transport where batteries aren't suitable. So this will be heavy trucks. This will be heavy trucks and marine and maybe some short distance aircraft. So we see hydrogen in transport. And then in net zero, in the deep decarbonisation scenario, we also see more hydrogen used in the building sector and the power sector. And the reason for this is that it supports the balancing. In net zero, we have very, very high levels of renewable penetration. And this puts pressure on the grid and on the system. And one way to relieve that pressure is to use electrolyzers so that when there's lots of sun and lots of wind and demand is low, you don't have curtailed electricity, you can produce the hydrogen. And then when there's less sun and wind, or sort of during winter or seasonal variations, you can then take the hydrogen that was created that would have been curtailed otherwise, and you can either use it to generate power, or you can use it directly to combust it for space heating. So we see hydrogen coming into those other sectors in the net zero scenario. And then just on the supply side, I mean, this is a slight repetition of what I said earlier, but how is that hydrogen being produced? We see that there's a broad mix between blue and green hydrogen, even by 2050. So we see, despite the fact that renewable costs are coming down very, very significantly, and despite the fact we expect electrolyzer costs to come down very significantly, we still think that there will be quite a large role for blue hydrogen in both the rapid and net zero scenarios. Huge regional variation here. Some regions will have cheap gas and a readily available storage in terms of CO2 storage, and where blue hydrogen would be more appropriate. Other regions will have sort of cheaper renewable energy, cheap solar, cheap wind, where you might see more green hydrogen. So very large regional variation. But in terms of the global mix, we do, at the moment and in these scenarios, we do see quite an even split between blue and green. And much of that will be pushing the existing grey hydrogen out of the mix as well. So there were my 4 questions. I've only touched on a very small part of what is in the outlook. If you have If you have interest and you want to see more, please go to bp.com and you can look at the Energy Outlook. You can download the report. All the data is there, all the charts are there, and the data behind the charts. So please do have a look. And I'll pause there for questions and comments and just a general discussion. So let me go to them. So I've got one question already. So it says, as you show the percentage mix of fossil fuels, what is total energy demand? So that we can look at barrels demanded from approximately. So this is from John Ballantyne. As you show the percentage of fossil, what is total energy demand? Total energy demand in barrels. Oh, I don't know. So total energy demand in exajoules is about 650. I don't think I have the equivalent number in barrels in my head, I'm afraid. So sorry, John, I can't help you there. I don't fully understand the question. So if you want to ask another question or ask it in a different way, that may help me. Sorry, I don't fully understand exactly the question as you've posed it. Second question from Javier Cuervo. So apologies if I've got your name wrong, Javier. So can you comment on nuclear energy? Yes, I can. Let me go back to. No, I don't have it. So our views on nuclear energy, again, it varies by scenario. In the business as usual scenario, nuclear as a share of primary energy is flat. Essentially, it remains broadly similar to what we see today. And that's driven by two very different trends. We see ongoing growth in China, which then spills out into other emerging markets. But we also see the ongoing decommissioning in the developed world. And so you have those two trends which are essentially balancing each other out. And so we see growth in absolute terms, but we don't see growth in share terms. In terms of the rapid and net zero scenarios, we do see more growth. The reason is coming back to that balancing issue. You know, nuclear energy, despite everyone's concerns that it is particularly effective at balancing a grid, an intermittent grid. You know, it's one of the few zero carbon energy sources that can balance, that can provide sort of baseload power, whether it's raining, whether there's sun, whether there's wind. And so we see a pickup in nuclear energy. Again, it stems from China, where China's nuclear build out is set to increase. That pushes down the costs, and those cost reductions are then spread out largely in the developing world again, because of the essentially the public opinion in the developed world. Although in net zero, we do see some hydrogen growth in the developed world, particularly in the small modular reactors. So we assume that towards the back end of the outlook, there is growing acceptance of some of these smaller modular reactors, which increase the demand for all the supply of nuclear power. So hopefully that answers the question on nuclear. John, sorry, okay. Increasing demand for energy is between 15 to 20% by 2050. So when we look at percentage of total demand by source, you did give the barrels for oil in 2050. Oh, so oil demand as a percentage of total primary energy, yes, it is a lot lower. It's lower than 15 to 20%. I'm afraid I don't have that number in my head at the moment, so apologies, John. So we've got a question from Helen Crosscall from Cabral Energy. So Helen, she says, do you have any comments on the mix of blue and green hydrogen going forward? Yeah, so Helen, in that last chart I just showed, this shows the mix as we see it in the rapid and net zero scenarios at the moment. There's a lot of uncertainty here. At the moment, there's a lot of discussions about the cost of electrolyzers. and the cost of electricity as it comes down. And there is a trade-off between, there is huge uncertainty about how much electrolyzers are going to pay for that electricity. So in the example that I just described, where you've got a sort of very high renewables penetration, you may see sort of, without electrolyzers, you may see a lot of curtailed energy. And so actually, if these electrolyzers can buy energy or are provided with electricity at zero cost or close to zero cost, then it makes them far more, it makes it much cheaper to produce green hydrogen. But there is a balance between that and utilization rates. So as I said, there is a mix, and it depends on the region, and it depends on if we see the cost profiles of electrolyzers move down. In creating blue hydrogen, well, creating grey hydrogen is something that we are familiar with. It's something that we've been doing for many decades. So we're not expecting the conversion of natural gas to hydrogen. We're not expecting those costs to come down particularly fast. The capture element of it, we think will be reduced, which will reduce the cost of blue hydrogen, but nowhere near the pace that we think that the cost of electrolyzers and green hydrogen will come down. And so that is, so there is that trade-off. Hopefully that answers your question, Ellen. So I've got a question here from Jennifer Lee, which says, did you factor in increased telework in kilometers driven? If so, what impact did you arrive at? Thank you. So Jennifer, I think a great question. So when we did this last summer, we were at the height of teleworking. So I'm actually in my, I'm actually at home at the moment. I haven't been into the office since last March. So obviously those vehicle kilometers, so I'm not traveling, and many of my colleagues aren't, and many parts of the world, that is true. We, even before the coronavirus, we assumed that there would be an increase in home working and teleworking. What we have seen is, we have assumed in these new scenarios is an acceleration in that. And actually, we think that we reached the levels that we had in 2050 5 to 10 years earlier than we had done. So there'll be obviously we've got a dip at the moment. We think that dip will come back, and so but it has accelerated that trend, absolutely, and they are included in our scenarios at the moment. I think if I look back on some of the assumptions we've made about the impacts of the coronavirus, I don't think we've been way off at the moment. It's too early to say about some of these permanent teleworking impacts. But I still think that the scenarios as we develop them in the summer are still valid, and they do include that impact. Okay. So I've got a question from William Jackson here from Dallas. Why do you think that hydrogen is essential to achieving net zero in the electric utility market? Hydrogen appears to be only useful in the role as a battery in that role. Would your opinion change if better batteries, such as solid state batteries, become commercially viable? I think it's a great question. I don't think it would. So everything I've looked at, and all the analysis we've done, is that solid state batteries are just not set up to manage large loads or large seasonal variations. I think the position that hydrogen can play in this, and the position, it's a similar way that pumped hydro currently plays, is that when the wind stops blowing for 2 or 3 weeks, which can happen, or when we don't see any sun for 2 weeks, batteries aren't very effective, and you just need so many of them to power whole economies, and just the materials required just become immense. I think one of the and so I don't think batteries will ever replace that, either the sort of 2-3 week period when we see those wind droughts, or the seasonal storage. I think the use of natural gas and hydrogen is that you can store it for, months on end. And the difference in demand between the winter and summer, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, means that the batteries, and even though they become much cheaper and much bigger, they're not going to be well suited to provide space heating in the Northern Hemisphere in winter. So I think they will fill other roles, in that they can fill 2 or 3 days of no wind or no sun. But I think to expect them to cover 2 or 3 months sort of in the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere is just asking too much of them. So another question on investment: what investment is required for transitions to gas and hydrogen, and to what extent private and public mix, particularly in emerging economy like China? Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. That's from John Ballantyne again. It's a great question, John. Let me try and I've got some graphs on investment here. So hopefully everyone can see this. This chart here shows the average annual investment in history between 2020 and 2050. So this is showing the investment in wind and solar in the past 5 years, so around, what's that, 350 billion. And then the investments in the different scenarios. Your question was about hydrogen, which we don't have haven't included in this chart, so apologies. Let me come back to your question. But while I'm on here, I'll just talk a bit about investments. I think we see a need for a huge pickup in investments in wind and solar, or renewables in general. And you can see that even in the business as usual, investments will be probably 50% more than we have seen in the recent past, where investments have been very high. And then in rapid, we're seeing multiples of that, and net zero even more. Similarly, investments in oil and gas, it sort of goes the other way, 800 billion a year in the recent past, slightly lower in BAU, although still, and I think it's worth making the point that the world still needs to invest significant amounts in oil and gas assets to maintain supply that is necessary, even in rapid. Potentially less so in net zero, but even in rapid, the world needs to invest many trillions of dollars to ensure that we have enough oil and gas. But you can see that the amount of investment in rapid and net zero are far lower. Your particular question, John, was about hydrogen and the use of market versus private and public mix. I think it's going to need to be both. We need upfront support from governments to get the hydrogen economy up and running. These are huge projects. They're very capital intensive, very infrastructure intensive, and they're technologically risky in parts. And so we are going to need support from the public sector. The most efficient way to do that would be to a high carbon price, so guarantee a high carbon price, or guarantee a price for hydrogen on the supply side. I think on the demand side, consumers also need incentives. It is very expensive to mothball a working iron steel foundry and create a new foundry based around hydrogen. There can be some conversion options in the power sector, but on the demand side, it is still very expensive. And so I think we will need to see public support and public intervention throughout the world. You mentioned China specifically. I think China is a good example of where you can see if China gets behind the hydrogen economy, you may see a much faster build out than we might see in the developed world, and it's just a feature of the way the Chinese can manage its economy, that it can build out these big infrastructure projects very fast. You don't have the same permitting issues that you have in the West, say, to build pipelines and things like that. You can actually, the state-owned enterprises can actually be told to convert their natural gas boilers to hydrogen boilers. So I think it can happen faster, and it can happen more easily, or not more easily, it just can happen faster. And but in the West, I see that there will be a mix of private and public. Okay, so so that's all the questions that I've had, unless I've missed anything. Don't know if anyone has got any more questions. If you do, I can please ask them now. Otherwise, I'll give a few more seconds. Otherwise, I can hand back to David. No, okay. Well, look, thank you very much for listening in. Thank you for your questions. I think they were great. And I'll hand back to David, and he can
Thank you, William. Thank you very much. And to BP as well. You know, the BP Outlook and the Statistical Review, highly used by all members of the International Association for Energy Economics. So we're very grateful for your research, for your time and your expertise today. For those listening, please let your friends and colleagues know this will be available free of charge on our Rewind station. And we encourage a wide view of this webinar. With that, I thank you again, William, and I officially close this webinar.
Thank you.